Hello, humanoids, and welcome to episode 4 in our course on Philosophy 2600, Ethics and Science. You may notice that this lecture title, Ethical Concepts and Theories, is the same, I think, as chapter 2 in your textbook, which you're supposed to be reading. So today, I'm really just trying to pick and choose some highlights from that chapter. And so if I cover something quickly, or you don't get it, you can, of course, go back and look at the slides, but you can also find just about everything I cover here in that chapter. And on that note, I'll try not to be so long-winded. You know, Akbar, he's here with me. He was chastising me that I was a little bit too long-winded last time, so we'll try to make it a little bit shorter, but I also want to try to be clear and helpful. All right, Akbar, you ready to work the slides? I wonder if you're seeing this cup of coffee. It's so cool. It's like steaming. PowerPoint's come a long way since I first started using it. Okay, all right, here's the outline. It looks longer than it's going to be. A little bit of review and a touch on history, ethics and history. I'll talk about the trolley problem, something you may have heard of or not, and then the problem with the trolley problem. Basically, trolley problem is a thought experiment, which is like an intuition pump to get you thinking about ethics. And there's good things and bad things about it. I like to use it, though, because it kind of gets people thinking and wondering what's going on with ethics, and it can clarify some things, maybe too clear. Then we'll talk the big things. I highlighted 3 types of ethics and 4 types of normative ethical theories. And again, these are spelled out in more detail in the textbook. I just really want to kind of highlight them here and draw your attention to them. A few distinctions briefly after that. And then we're going to move into reading Leon Kass's The Wisdom of Repugnance. So I'll just say a word about that and really a couple of the readings that are coming up, hoping to get your bearings with what we're doing coming up in the course. Okay, so starting with the review. This, I believe, is straight out of the textbook, what we mean by ethics or moral philosophy. I'll use those interchangeably. The study that concerns itself with the my little box is in the way. Here we go. With judgments as to the rightness or wrongness of actions, goodness or badness of results, or states of affairs, and the virtues and vices of actors. We'll spell that out a little bit in this lecture. Basically, ethics is about how you should live. What's the right thing to do? What's a good life? What's a good society? The average American, I looked this up, if you're average, you get the average lifespan. You have 27,375 days on planet Earth. How are you going to spend that time? That's, for me, ultimately what ethics is about. And I don't know if you've ever read Annie Dillard, wonderful author and philosopher, really. She said, I didn't find the exact quote, but basically how you spend your hours is how you spend your life, you know? So how should you spend your hours in your life? That's what we're trying to think about with ethics. Okay, a little bit of review. Last time we focused on this key distinction between convention and ethics. And we talked about what people do value and what people do think and what they do believe versus what they should value, what they should think, what they should believe, what they should do. That's the distinction. And we use Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail and civil disobedience to talk about the distinction between just and unjust laws, which has to rest on this prior distinction that there must be something different between ethics and the laws of any given society. And ethics would provide you with the standards to judge the laws or conventions of a society. So you could say some of those laws are just and some are unjust, right? So that's what we talked about last time. And I don't know if I put it specifically in terms of knowledge, but you're seeking ethical knowledge. And we'll talk a bit about how ethics and science, in some sense, in that way, are similar. They're both seeking knowledge. In this case, what should be the case? How can we distinguish false claims from true claims? So when somebody says that's wrong or that's right, how do you know if it is wrong or right? Or how do we distinguish just from unjust laws? So we also went over some standards that could be used to make these distinctions, right, to help us. And I'll say more about this later, but nature has been a long-standing standard to make this distinction between just and unjust laws. you could say there's no standard at all. There's no difference, which might lead you to kind of maybe a form of nihilism or something, to say it's all equivalent, every ethical claim. You could root it in God. We saw MLK do that. Conscience, we also saw him appealing to our conscience, that's maybe the source of moral knowledge. And ultimately, I come down on this idea of shared reason giving as the way we come to know something more about the way we ought to live our lives, right? And we'll get to this later, but there's always a specter of cultural relativism out there, that whatever I claim presupposes some frame of reference, and I just have to assert that and begin from there, but that's arbitrary in itself. That's coming up later. Okay, like I said, in this kind of review, kind of new stuff, it's all in the textbook, but ethics and science, at least what Carl Mitchell and I claim, were born together as philosophy or natural philosophy. And it began with this observation of difference, diversity, disagreement, the Spartans and the Athenians and the Turks and the Egyptians, right? Different cultures. And then the philosophic question is, are some better than other? By what standard? It would have to be a standard independent of any given culture, because otherwise you're just presupposing your culture is best and using it to judge all the other cultures. Nature was, for a very long time, and maybe still is for very many people, that standard. So Aristotle, for example, said that the nature of a thing spells out what it means for that thing to function, and to function well, and to function excellently. And the virtues of the thing are tied up with its nature. So a good watch, because its function, its nature, is to tell time. So whether it's telling time well or not. A good oak tree when you see it, right? It is flourishing. So just like the oak tree, you got to have the right soil for it to flourish. The same with humans. Humans have a particular nature, he claimed, and you got to have the right soil, that is the right society around people, to get them to develop into their most excellent possible form, right? Something like this was for a long time the grounds of ethical thought, of course, with a lot more complexity and disagreement about that. Modern science, though, has challenged this, because nature in the modern scientific worldview is not possessed of ends or functions or values in the same way it was in this Aristotelian pre-modern worldview. Nature is composed of matter and motion, atoms in the void. So to say something's natural no longer seems like a value statement, like, oh, if it's natural, therefore it's good. Well, no, that's been challenged now. So this is a deep kind of what I'll talk about is a meta-ethical question that's posed by modern natural science. All of this, again, check out the book for a little bit more on that. Okay, so that's some review, a little bit of history. Trolly Problem. This is a thought experiment by Philippa Foot, a wonderful philosopher, moral philosopher, who came up with this. And the first version, I believe, is just simply, look, you're this person standing on trolley tracks, and there's a trolley hurtling down the tracks, and it's a thought experiment, so you just have to run with it, right? So there's 5 people stuck on the tracks dead ahead, and if you let the trolley just go straight ahead, it's going to mow those people down and kill them. And you also know that the trolley operator has passed out or something, right? So it's going to mow these people over unless you flip the switch, okay? This is your only option, either not flip the switch or flip the switch. If you flip the switch, it goes down this side track here. You see where there's just one person. And that one person would be killed. And so the way a lot of people talk about this is then they'll ask their students, what would you do? And if those are your only options, most people say, well, I'd flip the switch. And then you ask, why would you flip the switch? And that's the key ethical question. Why? Okay, it's one thing to say, that's wrong, or that's what you should do. The next thing, the philosophic thing, is to say, why? And then come up with reasons. Again, that's why I think reason giving is at the heart of ethical knowledge, if there is such a thing. Why flip the switch? Well, because killing one person is better than 5. Right? It's just sort of, that this is a kind of utilitarian or consequentialist logic that, well, you're essentially saving a net of 4 lives if you flip the switch. Okay, so you can imagine all the variations on this thought experiment, right? And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this may be something fun to do in whatever you're doing in your life here, is think about this with folks that you're around. So Foot had this first one, the switch that we talked about. And then other authors have come up with different scenarios. Now, I don't talk about the fat man. I'll talk about the football player, say, or the big husky person. What if you're up on top of a bridge and now there's not a switch to flip and there's not an alternative track and there's 5 people stuck and you know the trolley's going to run over these 5 people unless you somehow tip over this large person and you know that that large person will stop the trolley, but the large person would be killed. It would save the 5 people though. Now, when I talk about this in my classroom, most students are like, well, I wouldn't push the guy off the bridge. That's horrible. But then you ask them, why, if you would have flipped the switch, isn't it the same outcome? You end up saving a net of 4 lives. So what is it? It's something about flipping a switch is more morally acceptable than actually pushing somebody. Then you could say, well, what if the big guy you knew was like a super evil person, right? Does the character of the persons involved matter? And you could go on and on. And so that's not my point, but I think these thought experiments are kind of they're valuable for pumping out these intuitions about what is it that makes something right or wrong, or good or bad, right? And it's a very stylized, artificial example, obviously, but I think it's interesting and useful as a place to start. I wouldn't end there, though, because I think you can see there's pretty obvious problems with the trolley problem. It's not realistic. That's not the way ethics happens in real life. Just consider opening schools in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. There's a big public policy question of ethics, whether and how to do that. Or think about a personal issue. That there's something, you've got a friend, but you're starting up this other group, and for whatever reason, you don't want your friend to be involved in that group. How do you break that news, right? Do you just kind of skirt around it? You just flat out tell a lie to kind of cover your butt so you don't have to uncover whatever uncomfortable thing it is with your friend? These are more like realistic ethics scenarios. And if you think about them, what have you got? Well, you've got uncertainty about the consequences. If I do this or that, I don't know what will happen. In the thought experiment, you say, you know for sure this will happen or that will happen. But that almost is never the case. You're also uncertain often about what actually are my choices. What's the nature of the problem? Even getting clear on that in real life is sometimes very murky. It's not so black and white. In other words, it's not like there's an either or choice I've got, and the consequences are clear. And that's very rarely what ethics is like, right? One person, I can't remember who, said the trolley problem is not a moral situation. It's more like a horror show, It's sort of like if those are your choices, you're not really a moral agent at that point, because this is bad no matter what happens, right? And other people say, look, this has scrubbed out all the morally relevant details, the relationships that are happening in real life ethics, and it's not really, doing ethics is not like an algorithm with an input and an output, and there's just a clear kind of equation that you're running in your head, right? It's much more complex than that. Okay, probably enough on the trolley problem. Okay, the big things I want to touch on, and I'll just touch on them because, again, they're in the text. But I want to call your attention. These are important. There are 3 types of ethics, okay? Descriptive is careful articulations of the beliefs, practices, laws, and conventions of a society, okay? That's, I think, the more I do this, the more important I see descriptive ethics really is. What actually is going on? That's a key thing to ask. And so I'm assigning this Leon Cass piece. You could assign it for many reasons, and there's a lot you can read into it. But I want us to pay attention to the way he talks about descriptive ethics when it comes to cloning. Then there's meta-ethics. Okay, this is the analysis of the meaning of central terms in ethics. What I mean by that is, for example, when you say that's wrong, are you just saying, I don't like that? What's going on when you use these evaluative claims, good, bad, right, wrong? Are those expressions just of your emotions? Or is there some reason behind them? Are they descriptions of reality somehow? So these are questions from meta-ethics. And that's why I'm assigning the Ruth Benedict. And again, in many ways, MLK Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail was wrestling with these meta-ethics claims about just and unjust laws. When I say that, what do I mean? How do I tell the difference, right? That's a kind of meta-ethics. And it's tied up with normative ethics. This is probably what you think most of when you think of ethics, which is the attempt to formulate and defend basic principles of moral conduct or standards of virtue. And so I'm going to have you read the Peter Singer piece about animal ethics to talk about different normative theories of ethics. So those are three types of ethics, but we're going to drill into that last one, normative ethics, because within normative ethics, Akbar, help me out, buddy. Okay. There's four types of theories, okay? This is my taxonomy. Ethicists spend their time debating this stuff, but let's keep it simple because I know this is an introduction for many of you. What is a normative ethical theory? Well, it's trying to give you the answer to the question, what makes actions, rules, or persons good or bad, right or wrong? What is it that makes something good or bad, or right or wrong? Let me give you some. Here's the four ones, and I'll give you some examples of each one. So virtue ethicists, virtue ethics, talk about the excellences, the virtues of somebody's character. And that is the key they want to claim to ethics. That is how you know if something's good or bad or right or wrong, is you have to look at the character of the person doing it, and the character of the person and their ability, in particular, for judgment in the moment to do the right thing in the right moment. There's no rule for that. There's no formula for that. You have to develop your character to do that. It's like being an excellent football player or ice hockey player. You've got to practice, practice, practice your skills so that when the chips are down, right, and then when it's on the line, you got to make the right decision. You have developed your moral character, your virtues, your moral virtues, especially courage and judgment to do the right thing, right? So as examples, think about a political convention when a party brings out their candidate. So much of that is saying, look, this is a wonderful leader who possesses all the right virtues, skills, to make the right decisions at the right time, because this is what a leader does, is has to make decisions. Right? Or think about honors like the Purple Heart in the military. What you're doing is acknowledging the excellences of this person, their virtues, usually like in the heat of battle in this case, right, or under a stressful situation. You say, you displayed excellent moral character. That's what ethics is all about, right, for virtue ethicists. I put Akbar there. There he is. Because, you know, when I watch Star Wars, I think he's a great example of somebody displaying judgment under pressure, courage, right? So these members of the resistance, in other words, in Star Wars, what you're doing when you're watching that movie is you're sizing up people's character and you're celebrating the displays of excellence that you see, right? So I think that's just so important about ethics. But that's not the only way to think about ethics. For a utilitarian, what makes something good or bad, right or wrong, are the consequences that result from your actions. So when you're doing ethics, moral reasoning, you're basically just calculating, although it's not like a calculator. You're trying to figure out, well, if I do option A, what will result? If I do option B, what will result? Or option C? And then you kind of weigh up good and bad in each case. And you say, which one has the greatest net benefit? The most good and the least bad, right? And I was trying to think of examples. They're all over the place. A vaccination comes out and you only have so many at first. How do you distribute a limited resource like that? Well, you could say, what's going to give us the most bang for the buck? What's going to give us the greatest positive outcomes, right? It seems obvious. In many ways, utilitarianism is an obvious, natural way to think about ethics. Or I put local land use development here. City councilors have to make decisions about, well, what kind of rules are we going to put in place to allow what kind of development? And they're often thinking, well, what will result of this and how do we get the best outcome we can get, right? So tons of examples of that. But there's a whole other theory, deontology. Don't look to the consequences of an action to determine whether it was right or wrong. Look to the motive of the action. Look to the principle that is animating that action, right? So you look to the intrinsic features of the action itself. So for example, cheating, don't cheat, right? Even if you know you won't get caught, it's the wrong thing to do. So regardless of the consequences, right? This is the kind of deontological way of thinking about ethics. Or tell the truth, even if it hurts, right? Even if it leads to a breakup of a relationship or something. It's the right thing to do, right? I really like the show Bob's Burgers. I don't know if anybody else watches that, but there's an episode where Bob wants to get a refund for a remote control helicopter that was just shoddily made and it broke. And he keeps saying, "It's the principal, Linda." That's his wife. You know, like he had to go through the most terrible ordeal to try to get this refund. And the consequences were not at all calculating out very well. But it wasn't about that for him, right? It was the right thing to do. Okay, the thing about, so there's this other one, feminism or ethics of care. The thing about deontology and utilitarianism, oh gosh, Akbar, help me. What are you doing, buddy? Is they tend to kind of adopt an abstract, removed, impartial perspective, like you're calculating consequences, or you're just looking at the motive behind an act or the principle of it. But that's not true to our lived experience as ethical beings. So this is where the feminism or ethics of care starts from, and it says actually we are constituted by our relationships, and these are central to ethics. Think about, for example, the duties the parents have to their children and the honor the children show their parents. These are particular relationships, and the relationship tells you what the right thing to do is, right? It tells you what is the moral quality of this situation, right? It's all about what are the relations involved. So this is such a crucial insight about ethics. Or what does it mean to be a good friend, right? Friendship as an essential feature of our moral life. And you can't understand that if you adopt an impartial view of calculating consequences or just thinking about the right thing to do for anybody in any situation abstractly. It doesn't work that way. So when I look at these, if I were you, I would say, be a pluralist, right? Because I think there's truth in all of them. There's weakness in all of them. I've never been a big fan of saying I'm a utilitarian or I'm a deontologist, as if you have to be one of these, right? No, I just look at these as tools or guidebooks or something to help you think about ethics. Okay, I'll wrap it up here quickly. So a few distinctions. This one I just think is funny because some people say I'm an ethicist. Well, I teach ethics classes, right? So does that mean I'm better than everybody else? Actually, there's been interesting sociology studies. No, ethics professors score about the same as the general public in terms of, and these are interesting studies, in terms of things like calling your mother, you know, or picking up garbage or something like this. They chose these examples. And it turns out ethics professors aren't better people. I think that's a problem, actually. I think if you spend your life thinking about this stuff, you should be better at it. But a lot of ethics professors say, not a problem because we're like sports commentators, you know? We don't have to be good at the sport. We just know how to talk about it. Ooh, I don't know about that. Okay, so I thought that was fun. We talked about this a lot, the distinction between ethics and science. So one thing to take away though is I want to challenge you to not have a strict fact-value dichotomy and think ethics is about values, science is about facts. Really, the whole course is about this relationship, right? Let's be open to maybe there's a lot more interlinkages there. Maybe you can start thinking of ethics as a science, and you can start thinking about science as intrinsically possessing ethical values at its very core, right? So ethics, doing ethics versus doing sociology or anthropology. I think sociologists and anthropologists are often some of the very best at descriptive ethics, right? In fact, Ruth Benedict, who we're going to read, was an anthropologist, so good at looking at different cultures and observing what they do and then articulating that, expressing it. But ethics, again, that's descriptive ethics. But to go on to do normative ethics, you got to go beyond that. And you have to say, okay, that's the way they do it there. Is that a good way to do it? Right? That's the tricky question in ethics. And that's where these normative ethical theories are coming into play to try to help us. I've already talked about this in a previous lecture. I think of ethics and politics as bleeding into each other because we're social creatures. So things that are personal to me inevitably start having interpersonal and political dimensions to them, and decisions made by politicians will impact me personally, right? So I don't see a way of boxing those off from each other. Okay, last thing, and then I'll cut you loose. You're going to be reading this piece on cloning by Leon Kass. By the way, Leon Kass, and my first book was on Leon Kass's Bioethics Council under George W. Bush. Leon Kass is often described as a bioconservative, meaning he's a conservative-leaning intellectual who thinks about bioethics issues. I guess that's a fair descriptor. I want to point that out because I'm so sick of people saying, oh, the academy, the university, it only teaches you liberal stuff, lefty liberal stuff. No, at least that's not the way I play it. I'm interested in deep thinking, and I think Cass is a really deep thinker. And hey, agree with him or not, walk with his thinking through this piece. It's really good stuff, I think. And I want you to think about it as a descriptive ethics exercise, because he's going to talk about cloning, and he wants to get us thinking, what actually is it? And he wants us to pay attention to the way we frame it. Because one of his points is modern science has corrupted our moral language, or narrowed it, or flattened it out, or thinned it, or diluted it, or something. So all we do is talk about rights and risks and distributive justice. So cloning is okay as long as it's not too physically risky, as long as people can choose it of their own free will, right? And as long as we can distribute it in a way that people have access to it. Cass wants to say, wait a second, that can't be all that there is to the moral dimensions of cloning. What about family relationships? What does this do to the quality of our lived experience as a family when we fundamentally change the act of procreation? Okay, so he wants to expand our moral vocabulary in interesting and I think challenging ways. And he wants us to think about also the role of emotions, this yuck factor or this repugnance. What role, if any, does that legitimately play in moral reasoning? Right. So these are deep questions to think about, and we'll dive into that next time. So until then, be a part of the resistance with Akbar, and be good, lead a good life, and may the force be with you.